Hello everyone, my name is Nathan Preston, and before I begin, if I pronounce anyone's name incorrectly, I apologise. I am going to talk about the change that has taken place in the acquisition of objects. This has seen a difference in how objects are acquired from museums, particularly in British museums, since the times of empire. I will look particularly at the case of the Benin bronzes and how their method of acquisition will not be possible in today's world, but I will also be looking at the reasons why this looting took place and if the why is continuing. This will not add anything to the restitution debate that is surrounding the bronzes. Whether they should be sent back or not has already been covered by many scholars from different angles. For example, Tiffany Jenkins is against restitution as she agrees with philosopher Kwame Anthony Apai that Nigeria's material culture no more belongs to the people of present-day Nigeria than to anyone else. But for Dan Hicks, the restitution of the Benin bronzes is about ending institutional racism that continues to depict Africans as unable to look after their heritage. While Kwame Wilson Salome contradicts Jenkins by arguing that the people of Nigeria have a right to access their cultural property. By looking at what they have wrote, it can reveal the changes that have taken place in the acquisition of museum items. It can also give a better insight on the ethics that govern the decision-making process of accepting or denying a certain item. In what is now the Edo state in southern Nigeria, the Oba, king of Benin, had autonomy which the trading companies in that area resented and wished for free access to the palm oil, rubber, and other plentiful natural resources. When James Phillips, Deputy Consul General of the Niger Coast Protectorate, arrived on the Niger coast in October 1896, he discussed with the European traders the Oba's refusal to allow palm oil kernels to leave his kingdom. Phillips believed that the solution was to remove the Oba over Ramwen and Ogbisi from power. In December 1896, Philip asked the Foreign Office permission to dispose of the Oba, and without waiting for a reply, he set off with 200 African support staff and 10 British officials. Phillips decided to go to Benin City during the Agua, the festival of the Yams, which was a time of self-denial and isolation for Benin's Oba. En route, Phillips had received a warning from the Etsekin chief, Doga, that it will be death to go on. This prediction would unfortunately come true for both Phillips and the people of Benin. The attack happened on 4th of January at the village of Ugbine. Neil McGregor, former director of the British Museum, portrays the attack on the British delegation as the reason for the punitive expedition that came afterwards. Dan Hicks disputes this claim and argues that an attack on Benin City had been planned for years and the Phillips massacre was merely a pretext for the attack on Benin. In response, it was decided to send a punitive expedition and the Niger Coast Protectorate Force under overall command of Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, whose force numbered around 1,500 men, not including the carriers. The punitive expedition took place from 9th to 27th of January 1897. The city of Benin was conquered on the 18th of February. During the occupation, it is possible that the amount taken can be as high as 10,000 bronzes, ivories, and other objects. Geoffrey Robertson amounts to what happened with the seizure of the city's treasures in order to sell them to make up the expense for the expedition as a crime against humanity. Either way, During war, looting was routine practice of getting soldiers' pay or a way of collecting souvenirs according with individuals' culture or morals. The value of what was taken from Benin cannot be overstated, as Henry Roth described in his book Great Benin a few years after the sacking, when he was the honorary curator of the Bankfield Museum, that the metal castings were the best specimens of antiquity or modern times. The reason for the taking of Benin's treasures can come down to more than just monetary gain. In Colonel Charles Caldwell's book Small Wars, he instructs that one of the objectives of these wars is to inflict punishment on those who have taken up arms, and that it is often necessary to injure property. But looting went further than just punishment for the defeated. Koala Wilson Salome describes the theft as not only an economic tool but also a means of showing dominance over a colonial people. In fact, the theft of the African people's cultural heritage can be compared to the Nazi theft from Jewish people, to bring a sense of inferiority to these people. This can be seen especially in the period of the 19th and early 20th century, which many indulged in taking cultural objects of the conquered people of Africa as being an aspect of controlling the resources and identity of African people. For the people that live in Benin City, the Edo people, shrines and plaques were a record of history, spiritual beliefs, and artistic progression. But to the British, they symbolised the over's power and the practice of human sacrifice, both the British wished to end. As Hicks puts forward, the sack of the city of Benin was to create the illusion of timelessness, so to deny Africa's history. Sir Reginald Bacon, who took part in the Benin expedition, wrote a book called Benin, the City of Blood, describing the metal castings as suggestive of almost Egyptian design, while the ivory bracelets suggestive of Chinese work. But this form of influencing history goes further than just changing a group's history. It can also go as far as to give excuses as to why Britain attacked Benin that can be justified. As while Roth does not dispute that the pieces were African, he does show the European way of changing identity by presenting the British narrative of events. Roth describes what happened to Benin City as deserving its fate and the Punitive Expedition as justifiable. The problem that has come with colonial times is that the form of colonial injustice, looting of cultural objects, is that in legal terms it is now viewed as being a thing of the past, as Carsten Stan puts it. This, though, cannot be said for the reasons behind the looting. The reasons for the looting that happened in colonial times remained as the years went by. One example can be seen with Somalia. Somalia has seen conflict and war since the 1970s, and after the state collapsed in 1991, the country has seen violence, banditry, and looting, especially in the southern parts. During the 1980s, the security services were known for stealing all valuables and destroying what was left during house searches. These searches were not just to supplement their salaries, but also as a tool to awaken their opponents and hostile groups. In the past, it was simply assumed that looting was driven by economic reasons, be them greed or a need to secure survival. But what happened in Somalia disproves that, as while most troops and traders involved in the trade of looted goods had economic reasons, the government and officials used this to punish the population for supporting the insurgents, which shows a continuation of Caldwell's instructions on how to punish the opposition. A more recent example can be seen in the beginning of 2013 with the jihadist group called ISIS, who had become known for their unprecedented spree of destruction of heritage sites. A reason for the destruction can be seen as a way of removing heretical blasphemous objects. For example, in northern Iraq city of Mosul, the archaeological museum was destroyed, but when it comes to looting of heritage sites, the key reason for it was to get a source of revenue. ISIS has looted several important sites and then trafficked them on the black market. The US State Department believes that the group gained $1.25 million by just looting one archaeological site, showing in the end that the reasons for looting have not changed since the sacking of Benin City, but there have been changes in how ethical it is to loot during war. In 1899, 2 years after the sacking of Benin City, 51 countries went to the Netherlands and signed the Hague Convention on the Rules of War, which stipulated that pillaging, seizure, destruction, or intention to damage religious institutions, historical monuments, and works of art are prohibited. While this international law did not come about until 1899, there was customary international law that was already in effect that did prohibit pillage, but this law did not apply to Africans. In fact, during the Berlin Conference, Articles 34 and 35 reserved the claims of sovereignty to European powers, while some African kingdoms were recognized for a time, but once they became economically negative for Europeans, for example Benin, they would use their superior military. It was also easier for people classed as other to have their autonomy disregarded, which led to African kingdoms being conquered. In fact, the recognition variable is key to the survival of the state, but this appears to have only been given when it was the dominant state's at the time best economic or geopolitical interest. Of the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions, both had little effect on the practice of looting during war. This can be especially seen during the Second World War, as the Third Reich and Soviet Union robbed museums in occupied territories, even though what happened went against the Hague Convention, and by the end of the 19th century the world was aware that these acts were wrong. Evidence, though, seems to point in the direction that if the Hague Convention had been signed in 1896, the expedition would still have gone ahead. This can be seen with the British invasion of Tibet. In 1903, 4 years after the creation of the Hague Convention, Britain sent a force of 18,000 to invade Tibet. In this force was Dr. Lawrence Waddell, the principal medical officer and official archaeologist, who had asked to go on this raid to acquire manuscripts and books that Waddell described as being so greatly required by Western scholars. Even though the official line was that looting was not permitted and servicemen were punished for this, officials like Dr. Waddell did go about looting. Over the years, new international laws have been created which has seen the reinforcement of the idea that acquiring objects during war is unethical. In 1954, a new Hague Convention was made which stipulated that cultural property could not be attacked or expropriated by warring parties. These rules, though, are not enforceable, as shown with Russia, who still refuses to return art seized during the Second World War. But the 1970 UNESCO Convention can be said to have had a bigger ripple effect than the Hague Conventions. This convention now has 140 states signed up to it, but cultural objects obtained before 1970 are returned at the decision of the museums and galleries that receive the repatriation request. It is in Article 7 of the Convention that stipulates that the state parties of the convention will take measures to prevent museums and similar institutions from getting cultural objects that were illegally exported. But the effectiveness of these laws can be debated when looking at a survey conducted by Interpol, which shows that during 2020 the theft of cultural property has not only continued but in some places has in fact risen. It was found that 854,742 pieces of cultural property was stolen globally and 567,463 objects taken from Europe itself, though when it comes to museums, the effectiveness can be seen with the Tate Gallery. The growing awareness of ownership questions of artworks and museum collections was helped to be brought about by the restitution of artworks stolen from their Jewish owners by the Nazis. On May 2014, a meeting of the Tate Board of Trustees unanimously agreed to deaccession the painting Beaching a Boat, Brighton to the claimant of the oil painting. This, though, would not have happened due to the British Museum Act of 1963. In the Act, Section 3, Subsection 4 prohibits the trustees of the museum from deaccessioning objects, but the painting could be returned due to a new act that was passed in 2009. The Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act of 2009 allows the return of objects related to the events during the Nazi era, 1st of January 1933 to 31st December 1945, as long as the advisory panel recommended and the Secretary of State approved the advisory panel's recommendation. The Spoliation Advisory Panel was tasked with considering the moral claim of Nazi-era cultural objects rather than the legal claims. In the Spoliation Advisory Panel report, it is noted that the Tate Gallery argued that it was the legal owner of the painting, but it was concluded that the claimant had the strong moral claim for the restitution of the painting. In the end, the claim succeeded, even with Tate's argument that the original owner, Baron Frederick Hatfield, could have sold it by his own free will. The panel was also critical of the Tate and its lack of standards in its provenance research. Paul Perrott describes the prime mission of museums are to collect, preserve, and transmit that part of our tactile heritage. But to carry these roles, museums must follow strict ethical principles. In the 90s, Perrott put forward a few guidelines on acquisitions. First, every museum should have a clearly expressed collection policy. Second, all proposed acquisitions should be fully studied to elicit as much information as possible. The British Museum, in its acquisition policy, lists that an object will only be acquired if they are legally available for acquisition and there is no reasonable cause to believe they were wrongfully taken from a lawful owner, looted from archaeological sites or museums, or wrongfully exported or imported. Even though the contents of the British Museum have been described as unequalled, it has also been seen as the largest depository of stolen objects. This can be argued that Western museums exhibiting the Benin bronzes shows a continuation of the imperial narrative that the African is not capable of appreciating the value of the objects. Acquisition that should reflect the seriousness of a museum's purpose far too frequently in the press reflect greed, manipulation and falsehood, which in the long term comes to tarnish the Institute's image. Museums are now more careful where their objects come from. In the past, curators dealt with antiquity sellers who acquire objects in questionable circumstances but now museum directors have demonstrated this behaviour is not acceptable. In 2003, during the war in Iraq, thousands of pieces of antiquities were stolen from the National Museum in Baghdad. This saw an international effort made to find and return the stolen artifacts. While in the same year, the UK passed the Dealing in Cultural Objects Offence Act, in which Britain would punish those that acquired, disposed, imported or exported tainted cultural objects. The British Museum was also the first to offer refuge to artworks and monuments in Iraq that was at risk of despoliation from ISIS, while also being insistent that they would be returned after the war. This level of change in the acquisition of objects for museums in what can be classed as ethical acquisition is not seen in the returning of stolen artifacts. In December 2018, it was reported that several Western museums were willing to return their bronzes, but only on loan. The British Museum used the excuse it could not de-access the items, but were not willing to ask the government to amend the law to allow it. Finally, to sum up, how the Benin bronzes was acquired would be unacceptable in the modern world. They were taken as war loot, not just to pay for the war, but to also take away the Edo people's identity and religion. This was used to help with solidifying British power in Benin and to help bring forward British myth of the reason for the war. As time has gone on, the reasons for looting during war have continued. This, though, has not translated into a continuation of the acceptance of the ways cultural objects were obtained in the past. This can be seen with Britain as with bringing into law how unacceptable it is to add war loot to a museum's collection. This has seen museums in Britain install in their acquisition policy in not receiving objects of questionable ethics in its obtainment. It has also witnessed museums like Tate's receive criticism for not doing a thorough research of the object's provenance. While this change from imperial acquisition has not gone down to translate on the return of items like the Benin bronzes from national museums, it still shows that museums are improving themselves so to fit with the ethics of the times they live in. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope everyone found it interesting to listen to.